This podcast is produced by the Harwood Productions Podcast Network. To learn more about the network and to find more of our shows, visit us online at www.harwoodpodcast.com.
Hi, I'm Cindy Harris. Welcome to the Photography Guild.
This month, we're going to be talking about macro photography. This is a kind of photography that I got into a couple of years ago, and I have so much fun with it. I can't wait to share it with you. So macro photography is about capturing images of things that are very small or things that we can't really see with the naked eye. Now, I use a 60mm macro lens on my camera, but most cameras nowadays have a macro setting that you can try and use when you're photographing. This photo here, this is a double hibiscus that I shot in Maui. And I was just walking along and I was taken by the color of this flower. But it wasn't until I put the camera up to my eye with that macro lens on that I could see those amazing little stamen in the middle. That's the kind of surprises you can get when you're doing macro photography. So there's a couple of things that we want to keep in mind when we're doing macro photography, and one of them is depth of focus. Now, we talked about that in another episode when we learned about our f-stops and everything. This photo here is very interesting. This is a cup of tea I was drinking, and I was really taken by the way the light was coming through the bottom of this cup. So in this photo, what I chose to do is have my depth of field be way at the back of the photo and have the blur be at the front. That's a choice that you make when you're doing macro photography. Another area to keep in mind when you're shooting is your background. The background is really important many times in macro photography. This was just a grass that was growing in my backyard, and the thing that I loved about it was its contrast between the background. Now in the background I had another plant that was kind of red and the green leaves and everything, and because I chose the shallow depth of focus, then I was able to have the grass be very sharp and angular and have the background still bring some beautiful color into the composition. Another thing to keep in mind is your focal point. Now, this is a hibiscus I took, and notice I chose to have the focal point be that giant piece with the stamen that's coming out of the flower. I didn't choose to have the throat of the flower, although I've taken photos where I chose for that to be the focal point. But in this case, I just love the contrast of that red and yellow. So when you're composing with your camera, choose your focal points carefully in macro photography. So now let's talk about all the fun things that we can take photos of. Well, flowers are obvious. On the left side here, this pink sort of passion flower, I saw this on the side of a road. I was taken again by its color. Then I get my macro lens up to it and I see these beautiful, almost purple eyelashes at the center. And you'll notice that's what I chose to get the clarity, the focal point on. On the flower on the right, that was a mandevilla flower in my backyard. I chose to put my camera down into the flower a bit, so I'm shooting at the very base of the flower and the way the color was coming up. So flowers are a really great subject matter for macro photography. And here are a couple of more. The one on the left is a rose in my garden where I wanted to get those sort of ruffly edges. And on the right are some tulips that I shot in Holland. And again, I went for this kind of abstract notion in the one on the right. So again, look at your depth of focus, look at your background, and look at your focal point when you're shooting flowers like this. And another great subject matter for macro photography are insects. Now, I'm not typically a bug kind of girl, but things like bumblebees and butterflies, and in this case, I was in Holland and I saw this amazing little ladybug, and she's like a reverse ladybug. She's black with red spots, and she was crawling along this stone wall, and these beautiful yellow petals were falling down. So I chose for her to be my focal point, and then I use the stone and the yellow petals as my backdrop, and it makes for a very striking photograph. Another interesting thing to play with macro photography is photographing water. Now, this was a vase that was sitting on my windowsill, and I had a single flower stem in it. But what I was taken by were the little bubbles that were attracting to the stem. So I put on my macro lens and I got in there, and what I chose to have my focal point be were the bubbles. And then I let the vase and all the dishes and things that were in the window just kind of blur into the background. It makes for a fairly interesting composition. Another thing that's fun to do with water is to go out early in the morning when there's dew on the flowers and plants outside and take photographs out there. When the sun's coming up, it starts to look almost like jewels. I've also heard people where if they don't have dew on their flowers, they take a spray bottle and they kind of spritz the flowers or the plants, and whatever it takes, but to get that kind of interesting water droplet look is really, really cool effect with your macro lens. And another thing that you can photograph with your macro lens are small objects, things like coins, or in this case, rings. And I have to tell you, I was inspired by one of our podcast viewers who had taken a photograph and shared it on our Flickr site of a football ring. And I had just loved the way he photographed that. So I was doing a cover for a book, and this is actually 2 family rings, one man, one woman, and the woman's ring is very tiny. And what I did is I chose to put them together, get my macro lens on there, make them the focus, and I was actually shooting out through a window. So I let the foliage come behind the window and let that be the backdrop. So small objects are also very effective to photograph with your macro settings. Couple of tips when you're using your macro photography is make sure to focus on the most important element of the scene. And also, if you're using an SLR, keep your ISO numbers low, like 100 or maybe 200. You want to have the finest grain photo you can, not a lot of noise. And also, for everybody, take a lot of pictures. Don't limit yourself to 1 or 2. Take 10. Try different angles. Try getting in closer. Try backing up. But that will give you the best chance of getting a great shot out of that session, is just to take a lot of photos. Now, there's a couple of reasons I love macro photography. One is because you can get some very artistic shots. The other is this. Here's an example of a layout page that I put together. I was in Holland earlier this month shooting the tulips. They were all in bloom in the country. And with using a macro lens, you can see it gives a lot of interest to your photographs. So, for example, I can use my wide angle lens for these big expansive shots like in the tulip field or some borders, but then you'll notice I start to get closer and closer, and pretty soon I'm at that beautiful yellow shot on the right where you're not even sure what that is, but it has to do with tulips or some kind of flower, and sure enough it was the center of this beautiful ruffled tulip. But it really helps give interest when you are putting your photos out in a layout. So this month our assignment is to practice our macro photography. Practice photographing flowers, insects, water, other small objects. Now, if you have a point and shoot camera, put your camera on the macro setting, which is the little flower, and then when you're photographing, remember to get in close and do your pre-focus on whatever you want your focal point to be, and then make sure your flash is off. Now, if you're using an SLR, make sure your ISO is about 1 or 200 for a fine grain. If you have a macro lens, you want to shoot on your AV setting so you can control your f-stops and your aperture. But if you don't have that, you also probably have a macro setting. So play with putting your camera on that. And as always, please share your photographs. Now, for those of you that are in the San Francisco Bay Area and come and meet with me at our monthly Photography Guild meetings, you all know to bring yours with you or email them to me. But for those of you around the world, please upload your shots to Flickr. We have got some incredible photographs of people that are following this podcast series with us from all over the world, and it's so inspirational to see what everyone else is doing. So next time we're going to be learning about shutter speed, and I'm really excited about this. This is the third point in our triangle, our exposure triangle, that we'll learn about, and it will be really fun. So I hope to see you back then.
For more information on this episode, go to our website and visit the Photography Guild show notes. Also, if you have any questions or ideas, send us an email. Thanks for watching. Want to see what's going on behind the scenes at Harwood Podcast Network? Maybe you want to know what's going on with your favorite shows. You can follow us by going to twitter.com/Harwood Podcast. We have daily entries, photos, all kinds of behind the scenes info. We'll see you on Twitter.